Hi there, my name is Caitlin Bandy and this is my channel BandysBooks, and today we are doing a Ranter review. We're going to be talking about the book Stone Blind by Natalie Haynes. This is an interesting situation. So this book was released in the UK, I believe almost a year ago, but it only just released in the United States a few days ago. I got an ARC copy of the US release version, so I'm here to review it today. This book was also recently long-listed for the Women's Prize, and I think this was a bit of a surprise. I mean, I know that there was a lot of hype around this book, but I don't know if there was that much expectation for this to be long-listed. I'll be interested to see if it continues on to the short list. So at this point, Natalie Haynes is pretty famous for writing about Greek mythology. She previously wrote Pandora's Jar and she wrote 1,000 Ships. I have yet to read Pandora's Jar, but I did read 1,000 Ships, and I appreciated that this was a whole focus on females in Greek mythology. So I went into Stone Blind expecting something similar, kind of a feminist look at, in this case, Medusa's story. So this book follows Medusa, who is the youngest of the Gorgon sisters. Her older sisters, Steno and Euryale, end up caring for her. She's dropped off on this island, and at first they don't know what to do with her because she's mortal and they're immortal. And they don't really know how to care for a mortal, but they learn. They love her so much that they actually go and watch what other mortals are doing, and they watch the animals that are on their islands, and through these actions they figure out how to care for Medusa. So they come to be almost parental figures to her. And then they become her protectors as well. So they've protected her for many, many years. And then when she's about 16, she unfortunately crosses paths with Poseidon in the Temple of Athene. And Poseidon desires her and he sexually assaults her. And Athene is enraged that her temple has been desecrated, that this assault occurred in her temple. And instead of lashing out at Poseidon, she curses Medusa. And that curse is what Medusa is famous for, the turning people to stone with one glance and having snakes on her head. Meanwhile, we see Perseus's quest to retrieve the head of a Gorgon to secure his mother's freedom from having to marry this king. This is kind of the general premise of the story of Medusa and basically the general outline of this particular story. So first of all, I want to discuss the formatting of this book. This book is told in multiple perspectives. Going in, I initially thought that this was going to be similar to Circe in that it was going to be solely from the perspective of Medusa, because it is described very much as Medusa's story. What I got instead was a very multi-POV type of story. We see several different perspectives. We get chapters from Athene, we get chapters from the Gorgon sisters, we get chapters from Perseus, we get chapters from Andromeda, we also get chapters from, of course, Medusa. But it seems that the story is more building up to Medusa's story than actually Medusa telling the story herself. That said, this story is told in a very well layered sort of a way. I felt like there were so many things that were mentioned in passing or just like little brief side notes that are eventually brought back into the plot of the story. I thought Natalie Haynes did a beautiful job of weaving details back and forth through each other throughout the story. Everything felt like it had a payoff. I didn't ever really feel like I was learning something for a pointless reason. Also, even though this book doesn't stick as tightly to Medusa's perspective as I had hoped it would, it still is very effective at portraying what it's like to be a woman who has suffered abuse. Medusa has suffered at the hands of Poseidon, at the hands of Athene, and at the hands of Perseus. And we see the trauma that she's experiencing throughout the book. So she goes through one trauma and we see her dealing with post-traumatic stress, basically. We see her going through a second trauma and she falls into just a complete pit of despair. And then we see her going through this third trauma and she finally turns to rage and anger and fury. And I thought that all of the reactions that she went through in all the different scenarios were so well done. I thought that, all of the responses seemed to be pretty accurate to what she was experiencing at the time. One thing that I will definitely applaud Haynes for is her use of humor. I have heard that she was a stand-up comedian prior to becoming an author, and you can see that her humor is really shining through in the book. There's some really great banter between the deities. In particular, I'm thinking of like Athene and Hermes. Their banter between the two of them is really good, but Zeus and his wife, like there's just a lot of very clever repartee between some of the different deities that kind of keeps the book from getting too somber, because this is a kind of depressing story. It's ultimately about Medusa and her being victimized repeatedly. So this little bit of humor that's interjected kind of helps it from being super depressing. I mean, it's still depressing and sad, but it like keeps it a little bit lighter instead of like sinking into a complete pit of despair. So one thing that I found really interesting, which I don't know was an intentional aspect of this story, was that I thought that the point in the story where Medusa is cursed paralleled what people experience when they're dealing with chronic illness. So Medusa wakes up and she's got snakes crawling out of her head. Her eyes are turning things to stone. She's in excruciating pain. Her head hurts, her eyes hurt, her body feels terrible. And she is despairing. She is basically crawled into a dark tunnel, into a cave, and is hiding herself from the world. And there's moments where her sisters are trying to talk to her. They're trying to encourage her to come out. They're encouraging her to keep living. And the reaction that Medusa has, it just really reminded me of someone that's dealing with a really severe chronic illness, where you feel like your body is failing you. You feel like things aren't happening the way that they're supposed to be. You're angry, you're depressed, you're scared. There's all of these elements that mixed in really well. And like I said, I don't know that that was an intentional piece of messaging, but to me, as somebody that deals with a chronic illness, I really related to what was going on with Medusa at that point in the story. I also appreciated that all of the characters in this book were really well characterized. They're very rich. Even like the little minor side characters. For example, Hermes shows up for a short period of the story, and he was really rich and detailed, and I had a good idea of who he was by the end of his short little passage. Or Andromeda, I knew who she was. Like every single character that pops up, you really get a good feeling for who they are. And I felt very strongly about a lot of the different deities. I had unfavorable feelings about some of them, favorable feelings about other of them. I thought it was a really good thing that this book elicited such a strong response to different people throughout the story. And finally, one other thing that this delves into a bit is victim shaming and victim blaming. So as was mentioned, we have a moment where Medusa is sexually assaulted by Poseidon, and we have Athene who is watching this happen. And this happens in her temple, so she's angry because she feels her temple has been dishonored and desecrated. But instead of blaming Poseidon, instead of going after the deity and the male in this scenario, she instead decides to torture Medusa. And she blames Medusa for the assault. She blames Medusa for what happened to her temple. She blames Medusa for the situation. And it was really interesting to me when we see clearly that Medusa is a victim and she didn't want what happened to her at all in any way, shape, or form. So I just thought it was kind of an interesting look at like what victim shaming and victim blaming can do to someone. Now onto the critiques. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this review, one of the things going into the story that I was kind of expecting, and it seems a lot of people were expecting, was this to be Medusa's story, told in her own words, focused on her basically. What we really got was Medusa as a semi-major POV, but not the main POV. We actually get more of Perseus, more of Athene, more of Andromeda, and more of the Gorgon sisters than we do of Medusa speaking for herself. Now, I will say that I felt that that was explained accurately at the end of the story, and like the ending made it make sense, and all of these different POVs kind of collide to give you Medusa's story at the end anyways. Like that's the focal point of all these different POVs. However, I wished there was more of Medusa telling her story for herself. I think that was one of the things that was so remarkable about Circe by Madeline Miller. And I hate to compare all Greek mythology retellings to Circe, but honestly, Circe and Song of Achilles are like the gold standard for modern retells. And so Circe did that really effectively, where she took a minor Greek mythological character and turned them into a very sympathetic narrator. And we don't get that as much with Medusa's story here. I did feel sympathy for her. I did understand the majority of the story and everything, but I just wish that we heard a little bit more from her perspective. Another thing that I mentioned in the positive portion of this review was that there's a lot of humor used within this book, and that is mostly positive, but there are a couple moments where I felt like the humor kind of broke the flow of the story, like the interjections were a little bit disruptive. There are a couple points in the story where Haynes directly breaks the fourth wall and states things to the audience outright. I felt like those cases really kind of interrupted the flow for me. They felt clunky and just out of place, honestly. I think had she just stuck to the humor that she'd introduced through like the dialogue with the gods and things like that, it would have been a little more successful. I think for me, I would remove the fourth wall interjections. And finally, I felt like this book had some issues with showing instead of telling. So, as I mentioned, there's points where Haynes directly breaks the fourth wall. And I think that her intent was to be funny, but at points it felt like she was saying, I think you as the reader are too dumb to understand what is happening here, so I'm going to tell you very, very directly what is going on. I think in particular, there was a lot of commentary about Perseus and like directing us to feel a specific way about him, when had the story just been allowed to progress, we would have probably come to those feelings naturally and organically without being spoon-fed. So for me, that part was a little bit unsuccessful. Overall, I enjoyed the story. I think that it was overwhelmingly a pretty good book. I think, that the critiques that I have are valid, but I don't think it would stop me from reading this again. I think that if someone came to me and said, hey, I'm looking for a good modern Greek retelling, I would probably hand them Circe first, but if they'd already read Circe, then I would possibly recommend this one. I do remember bits and pieces of Medusa's story from school and my own studies of Greek mythology, so I won't say that it was the most surprising story ever, but I thought that the different POVs and the dynamics between the gods and things kept it pretty interesting. So that's the end of my review. If you liked it, hit the thumbs up and comment down below. Tell me, which character from Greek mythology would you love to see a modern retell of? Because I feel like there's so many amazing options. And if you're not already subscribed to this channel, you know what to do. Hit the subscribe button down below, as well as the notification bell so that you never miss a video. And that way we can see each other again soon. Thanks so much for joining. Bye.